Hello, beautiful soul. So today I want to talk about the Mambo and the Hougan as guardians of consciousness. And I'm going to use obviously the Vodou priest and priestess, the Mambo and Hougan, uh, to use certain frameworks to understand what is the role that we are playing at a very connecting certain different practices so that we can explore the lens of what is really happening. What is the role the shaman, the curandero, the priest, priestess in 21 divisions and other practices for that matter plays? And we're also going to use a little bit of some ancient esoteric teachings as well as some genetic research to understand at a very deeper level why we have certain perspectives about esoteric practices, spiritual ancestral practices that sometimes we don't understand. And I'm going to tell you the truth. I grew up seeing this, and I had a certain perspective that my ignorance, obviously, was from ignorance that I had to work through in order for me to truly be able to appreciate and understand the technology, the wisdom, and the knowledge that is encoded in a Mambo and a Hougan in 21 divisions or Vodou or any other practices that is shamanic based, ancestral based, right? So we are going to explore something that bridges three different worlds, the philosophical framework of one of India's greatest sages. We're going to use the lived practice experiences of the Caribbean spiritual traditions and also the DNA studies that suggest our ancestors' supernatural abilities might be coded in our genes. So this is no history. This is not just going to be about history. And I'm not trying to do a history class, but it's about why certain spiritual practices really terrify us, why some bloodlines seems to carry abilities that others don't, and what happens to a society when it systematically eliminates the people that can access non-ordinary states of consciousness. So let's begin with a question. What is a shaman? What is a curandero? What is a mamboa or hugam? Let's start with the definition of the shaman, not in the traditional sense, but even when we look at the culture of Siberia or Siberia, however you pronounce, I'm going to say Siberia. The role of the shaman is, it's not just from the Native American. A lot of people believe, okay, only the ones that are in the Amazon region has the term, can be called shaman, or maybe some of the shamans from Mexico or Siberia. But the function of the shaman that they actually did that has survived in those places where it's still being practiced the way perhaps it was most similarly practiced to before, right? Um, but the role exists in every culture. There is something similar to what is a shaman. In every indigenous culture, people had to have someone, a priest, priestess, shaman, healer that was able to serve the functions on thousands of years ago. We can talk about the oracles, right, from the different pantheons. So when we strip away the cultural specifics, what we find is some functions that are very specific. Shamans as people whose consciousness operates beyond the normal boundaries of what we believe this reality is about. So they're not just healers or performing, ritualistic people. They're not just performing, they're actually bridging the conscious and unconscious, right? They're conduits. They maintain a connection to aspects of reality that most people can perceive directly in today's day, right? But before, there were someone or some people that were given that specific role, that were chosen by the people to carry that role, to continue the sanity, the balance of the community. Because what happened if they didn't have someone is that they were vulnerable to natural forces, right? And they knew that. I mean, if you look at the Aztecs and the history of the Aztecs, and they were doing rituals and stuff like that to maintain the balance of nature or to bring rain or whatever they were trying to do. So our ancestors wasn't just about, they knew beyond what we can comprehend how nature had to be greatly, we had to be greatly in connection with nature for our own survival. And understanding the hidden patterns, reading the signs, the invisible, that were invisible to most, but visible to the person that had the role of the shaman, or those that were studying under the shaman, the healer. They could see the patterns that normally someone wouldn't be able to perceive. And they were able to maintain a balance between the seen and the unseen forces, right? And it was a necessity. This wasn't, I want to because I think we need to do this so that we can get more X, Y, and Z. It was more about necessity, about maintaining the balance, our connection to nature in a very balanced manner. So let's think about this. Let's really think about what this means. So not every civilization developed, around places where they had to. Some people were developing in much more difficult environments, right? Where they had to even be able to work with even more hidden forces to access information beyond our five senses, right? So depending on the community and what it required for surviving, the person the person that is acting as the shaman is going to have even more direct communication with some of these unforeseen ancient powers, ancient forces. So what our people today cannot understand is that our technology, our scientific perspective, right? We have gained a sense of something, right? But we have lost a very strong direct communication with nature that our ancestors had. So this brings me to the Mambo and Hougan, right, in 21 divisions and Vodou, because these people, these practitioners, embody this shamanic function. They're doing something that is even more complex, to be honest. They are not just maintaining one spiritual tradition, they're holding three distinct streams of the African tradition religions, spiritual religions, ancestral practices, the indigenous Caribbean practices of the Taino, and the European Catholic mysticism. So it's very complex to hold three different streams of consciousness and combine it into one. And in this process, we have to go through a very turbulent tests and trials and errors and healing that we also have to do ourselves in order for us to be able to understand what these luas, these luases, these mysteries are. So it's imagine if it's difficult holding one, one perspective, where for example, people in India are holding perhaps one aspect, maybe Shivaism, and somebody else may be holding just a specific narrative through perhaps just what we comprehend in different, you know, Catholics or Christianity or whatever the religion practice or esoteric practice they're practicing. But in 21 divisions, and also Vodou, because in Vodou practitioners, a lot of them incorporate the same thing that we incorporate. I mean, the same thing that we incorporate with the natives and the hiding the lua behind the saint and all of that. So there are three things that we have to hold together that can really drive us crazy when we're really trying to understand deeper aspects of this tradition. So, and this happened, as we all know, because of the horror of slavery, right? When we're not going to get into that story, I think we all know the slavery process that happened in the island. So as these people, these Africans, are forced to come to the Caribbean, and the indigenous population that had a very spiritual, sophisticated technology, understanding, wisdom, now is being merged with the African and eventually with the Catholic mysticism. So what emerges isn't just missing the symbols, it's really a fusion, a new spiritual ecosystem where the practitioners have to learn to navigate multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. Very, very complex. Probably, honestly, because I think it's one of the most complex. I mean, what comes, why I love using the Indian framework is because in Kashmir's Shivaism, I see a lot of connections to what is happening in understanding the knowledge and the wisdom that it is hiding behind or representing these ancient forces. So I see a very strong connection, and it's very, Kashmir's Shivaism is very complex, right? As every other spiritual practice, but I see direct connections here to help understand the framework, the ecosystem that we're navigating, the complexity that we're navigating, and to understand the Mambo and the Hougan are actually working with, we need, like what are we really working with? When people say misterio, when people say the loi, when they say the energy, what are we really referring to? Is ancient forces, cosmic forces, and sometimes ancestral energies, right? Spirits, beings, and ascended energies, and in every dimension, and not I guess dimension might be the right word, but the frequency of the being, right? So it doesn't have to be extremely highly elevated. There is a frequency that gives us like an accordion. It has many multiples, right? So I cannot just say that every single Luat is a very highly ascended being. That doesn't feel comfortable to me, because there are variations of this. So to understand the complexity, what the Mambo and the Hougan are dealing with, we have to understand and appreciate and have a humility that a lot of us don't have. And I was guilty of that for many years as well, because we have to see the brilliance, the enlightenment of a powerful, humble, grounded Mambo and Hougan. I'm not talking about an arrogant person that is just after, followers, about gossiping, and they're obviously not psychologically mature enough to even, and they might be able to hold spiritual understanding and maybe lacking psychologically maturity, right? Which is that I can go into a whole thing about the spiritual ego and how it may be drunken with the spiritual forces of the divine grace that comes to the person, the caballo de misterio, right? But that's another conversation for another day. But if we talk about the sage Adi Chankra, 8th century sage, Indian philosopher, that one of the persons that I consider a mentor talked about, one of the things that brought my attention in desire to learn more about this philosopher was that he was very much focused about the non-dualistic path, right? And the central teaching was that Brahman is real consciousness, right? The understanding of separation and unity, and that an individual soul is no different from the absolute. So we are, when I see the teachings of Chankra and his teachings about consciousness itself is the fundamental reality, like everything we perceive as separate is you, me, you, the share, anything, right? It's really one and the same. And it's a unified field of awareness that appears as many things, like the accordion. So he called the forces that create this appearance Maya. This is where the idea of Maya comes from, that we all know about, right? The illusion and the idea of separation and so on. So, and a lot of people think Maya is illusion, but it really is, makes people believe this is fake, this is not real, this is a fake reality, which is not true. That wasn't the intention behind that. What Maya means is that this world is real as an appearance, right? But it's not false. Very big difference here is we are connected with that. The more we go through this spiritual journey, we are really connected to everything. We can feel what the other person is feeling. This is where the empath idea comes in. But the shamans and some of the Mambo and Hougans can penetrate through, when they're channeling or through their own evolution, can penetrate the energy of the patient they're seeing, the person that they're seeing, and they can use their energy, their consciousness to pull out things that the person needs help with, that needs healing with. That, a lot of the times it's not just about divination, it's about the actual healing that needs to happen, right? So this, I think, is important, because when a Mambo facilitates for example, they become the caballo and they're being possessed by the Lua, as a misterio. What's actually happening from Adi Chankra's perspective is that consciousness is temporarily operating through that person's nervous system in an expanded mode. So the usual narrow band, the accordion of individual awareness, dissolves, and a wider spectrum can be expressed through itself. So the Lua perhaps are, of course, they are autonomous entities where they operate regardless of what we do, right? But some of these energies, these ancient powers, are also part of our psychic structure. And please understand, I'm not saying that some of these energies, the mysterios, are within us. What I'm saying is some of these energies that we call powerful, these archetypes, these mysterios, are operating and have a direct link to an aspect of us within our psyche. And I think in some people may say, like, okay, let's say, for example, Archangel Michael has a representative, a person within the family lineage that works under that specific lua, and they act on behalf of the lua, but they're not the direct lua. So it's almost like that. So these powers that are within our psychic structure are not the lua themselves, but they are operating within the vibration of the teachings of the lua. So why is this important? Is because there are particular frequencies or modes of consciousness that appear, that a prepared nervous system can tune into, but the nervous system has to heal before it can hold those frequencies. Otherwise, the person become drunken with power and over identification with the lua or the energy, the misterio, or even the archetype of force. However, I know a misterio, when we see it through the language of an archetype, may seem like, okay, now we're just talking about psychology. I'm not talking about psychology. The archetype is a primal instinct, in instinctive force within our psyche and outside of the psyche. So someone that has worked on themselves, sometimes the Mambo and Hougans are chosen in at an early age because we're born in the tradition. A lot of people can start preparing for that, right? But they also have to go through their own healing process, because what happens when somebody is not prepared, when their nervous system isn't prepared to hold that energy of the misterio, is that the person can even die. The person can go into psychosis. The person can have a lot of issues in their life. They can mount, but they don't have 100%. There is a variation. I'm not going to go into the variation of like who can mount, who can do 100% possession, who can be a little conscious, who can be very conscious and still mount. And there are different facets of that leads one to understand how, as we advance, in my opinion, I don't want to just lose full consciousness of myself when I allow a misterio to come through to do work, because I'm still learning from the experience. But if I'm completely gone, I'm completely gone. But when I'm present enough that I can learn from what is being done, I'm also ascending in consciousness. That's my perspective. So the Mambo and Hougan work, it's like this Ari Chankra described the tantric work about Kundalini and, the dormant serpent, the coil at the base. And when the awakened energy is properly awakened, right, these forces rises through the energy centers and progressively is completely dissolving all the limitations that obscure our true nature of the person, right? The Mambo and Hougan work with the same reality using different cultural technology. And they understand something crucial. At the deepest level, there is only one divine reality. But in practice, that one reality manifests through countless forms, each accessible through particular approaches, right? Specific rituals, specific prayers, specific invocations, specific bebes. So there's sigils that are being done to call in different astral fluid, like the astral fluid that is being invoked to allow for that energy to come through and so on. So this isn't a contradiction. It is a very sophisticated wisdom that the Mambo and Hougan has to sit with and hold a container for 3 specific ecosystems. So now we're going to add another layer, because there was a research that I was looking at, and it was by Dr. Dean Radin, a scientist studying the psych abilities, right? Like perception, telepathy, healing, and like throughout the ages, the centuries, and the genes and so on, and like where is that gene, and who has more possibilities of having these abilities awaken or in the family line, and there is a specific genetic sequence on chromosome 7 that correlates with these abilities. But this is where it really gets disturbing, because he found a very strong negative correlation between high density Christians population, specifically in areas near the birthplace of the Holy Roman Empire, Italy and Spain, and this specific genotype that he's talking about. And what I think this means is the Inquisition, right? And I think he talked a little bit about that, which hunted and killed people accused of witchcraft, psychic abilities, and healing powers, was essentially really conducting the genetic engineering, right? Because by systematically eliminating people who had displayed these abilities, these traits, they were removing the genes from the population. Because down the line, as time passed, people were afraid, so they had to hide that. And the more they hid the ability, the gene sat back, right? It's like hiding from itself. So generation after generation, the individuals whose nervous system naturally operated with very less rigid boundaries between self and others, right? Self and other, and self and other non-ordinary beings, non-ordinary reality. These people were killed. Their genes were removed from the gene pool, he says. And what he estimated was that about 40% of the population lacks the genetic sequence that facilitates these experiences. And what he was saying was, because there are some people with a high density, they have a very high density of like they're very skeptic about anything spiritual or paranormal. And what he found is that these people that are specifically very skeptic about spirituality or the paranormal are highly concentrated in Christian regions. So what to me, what this is saying is the research. There was another researcher, Dr. I forgot the name, Dr. Nolan, I think, where they were focusing on the idea that certain bloodlines can be traced back to ancient times and maybe more attuned to interacting with non-human intelligence, including UFOs and other unidentified area phenomenon. They're doing a lot of research on that. So they've been studying people like John Burroughs, who was somebody that was reported that he witnessed and experienced accidents and incidents due to the UAPs. And anyways, the whole thing is that these people were supposedly chosen for encounters because of their bloodlines, or if the encounters themselves, they were trying to determine that, or if the encounter themselves modify their DNA. And some individuals appear to be more magnetic for this type of phenomena. And Burroughs described that he frequently, like he was having experiences that were a little strange. And anyway, so the whole idea was, I think what this says is to understand the shamanic capacity isn't just a cultural or a learned thing, it's a biological component. Some of our nervous system are genetically predisposed to operate with less friction, rigidity. We can become immersed, and we are more apt to connect with something beyond. And some of us that don't have that naturally due to trauma or the gene repression, we can train ourselves. I think everybody has a capacity. Of course, some have more past life trainings and in between life training and so on. But let's just put all of this together now. This whole thing that I'm talking about, what you know we're talking about is what we might call a consciousness-based ecosystem. It's just like a biological ecosystem needs biodiversity, right? To remain healthy, the consciousness ecosystems require different types of awareness operating in balance. So when shamanic connections are severed, like this, something is broken when the people can navigate, the people who can navigate non-ordinary reality are eliminated. The whole system becomes sick because we are all part of the psyche. We're all part of the collective consciousness. So when these energies go and they have to be repressed because we're hiding them or because we are afraid of exposing them, they go underground, they become dormant. And when they erupt, there is going to be a collective pathology, right? There's going to be a collective sickness that emerges. So we see this when we have epidemics and, a lot of, additions collectively or collective madness where, there is environmental destruction and conspiracy, theories and so many issues, right? And so can we understand the spiritual energies when denied? They find another way to come online, to find perhaps distorted outlets because we're repressing them. So they have to come out somehow. And sometimes that's through additions to, illness, disease, right? Or collective issues where the whole culture is going through something, or planetary, right? So we can go back to Adi Chankra and see through the crisis in the, I think it was in the 8th century, the understanding of how some practices, even in India, they had to go through this, where they lost a little bit of the Ayurveda knowledge at one point for a while, because it was giving an idea that Ayurveda was something to deal with demons for a while. And people actually got sick because they were repressing the natural teachings, right? So anyways, the genetic, what I found interesting about the genetic bloodline, the transmission of the direct realization, right? Working with these ancient powers, and how some people are predisposed and some people are predisposed to be skeptics because they have no framework to understand. They don't have that in the gene pool. So when we talk to them about anything like this, they're going to look at us like we have 4 horns, because to them it's not part of their vocabulary. They cannot comprehend what that means. They don't have that gene pool. They're going to have an adverse reaction to it. We may say they're really judgmental, they're ignorant, but they don't have that pool. How can we judge them? They don't have the pool. They don't have the gene pool. And some of them may start coming out of that. I had a client like that I was really sorry for this person, because she didn't get it. So anyways, here's where the genetic and the spiritual dimensions kind of intersect. They kind of come together, where Adi Chankra established monasteries and created systems of lineage for transmission purposes that continue up to today, right? And these lineages really maintain not just the philosophical teachings, but the actual practices for awakening and direct experience. So the Mambo and Hougan represents the same thing in the African diaspora, where when enslaved population had their, traditional practices, not only the Africans, but the Tainos too. And then eventually the mulattoes that were also amazed and nobody trusted them. And a lot of betrayal in the ancestral practices of 21 divisions and Vodou. So because there was even betrayal before a lot of these people were to the Caribbean, a lot of them were already experiencing slavery in other forms. There is a lot of betrayal in so many ways. So when the slave populations come together and they had to figure out how they're going to continue the ancestral teachings forward to preserve it, right? And to then modify it according to the new people that were coming in sync with the land and the experience and so on. They had to create something new, a new technology, a spiritual ecosystem that incorporated 3 in 1. And they maintain this essential technology, the methods to dissolve the illusions of separation and experience directly what lies beyond the ordinary perception. So here's what most people don't understand, though, is that the reasons we are terrified of genuine spiritual practice is because it threatens everything we think we know. Our ego believes something and he doesn't want to give up. So Chankra explained this very precisely when he talked about the ego, our sense of being a separate individual. It constructs, it really gives the foundation, the construction, an elaborate identity, right? Around the body, the emotions, our thoughts, our social roles about what this life is about. And the entire structure of egoic consciousness depend on maintaining that illusion. I am this particular thing. And when we have to give up that, it's a huge process. So any practice that genuinely connects us to a wider reality threatens this constructed identity, our ego identity, with making us face a potential dissolution that can be very scary. So this is why authentic traditions don't just hand out technologies to anyone who asks. That's why these are closed door practices where you have to go through initiations and a lot of tests and trials in order for you to evolve, right? Through extensive preparation. So in Vodou, 21 divisions, initiates, we go through a lot of periods of isolation, restrictions, sometimes dietary restrictions, spiritual bath restrictions, diets that we don't, spiritual diets that sometimes we don't want to do because they are, and a lot of exposure to learning who to trust, discernment, not only of this life, this reality, but beyond this reality. So the ego doesn't have the stability to handle it all, when we don't have the right initiation process. So let's think about what happens when someone unprepared experiences possession or Kundalini awakening. The ego collapses and it's like lost. It can get into psychosis, obviously neurosis. The ego doesn't have the stability, it's grasping. What should become a liberation becomes destabilization. So what should be a healing possession becomes obsessive. I need this power. I need this spirit. I need this luad. Why I'm not feeling the energy of the luad? Why I don't? And it becomes obsessive because we were not psychologically prepared. We didn't have the spiritual maturity. And what the genetic research shows, when we think about it, is if 40% of the population is lacking the sequence associated with the psych abilities, their nervous system may be selected for stability within very narrow band of consciousness. They cannot get it. No matter how many initiations they do or they think they're doing, they are not going to be able to get it until they do a lot of, they go through an extensive process to expand and stretch their nervous system to be able, and their psyche, to be able to hold the accordion of the dimension, the awareness, the frequencies, and so on. And attempting to do so without proper guidance is really like jumping into the void and not knowing if you're going to get insane or die in the process, because it's very dangerous. So I wanted to have this conversation because I think a lot of people don't understand the Mambo and Hougan as people that are preserving a threefold tradition ecosystem, people that are guardians of the threshold, people that have enlightenment and a power, and hopefully a grounded power that is not just arrogance and pride, but grounded. And in this process, we can have a respect for the Mambo and Hougan that we didn't have before if we understand what I just talked about. If you understand what I just talked about, you will understand that when a Mambo is working with a misterio, let's say, for example, Dambala, the serpent Lua, associated with, the Catholic saint, the St. Patrick, in some lineages, she's not really just equating Vodou spirit with Catholic saint. She's recognizing that the archetype of the instinctual power of the serpent wisdom is going to exist across tradition. Of course, some Mambo and Hougan's priests and priestesses, curanderas, santeros, however we want to call them in 21 divisions, there are many different names. The thing is that some people are just very much 21 division. And there are people, especially in today's age, where they're interested and they're getting insights from many different cultures. And they're not just to see one thing. They have to be able to see multiple things, to hold multiple truths, not making one spiritual practice better than the other, right? So Vodou priest, priestess, 21 division priest, priestess, Mambo, Hougan, that is able to hold that and understand that and can see the connections between the Bala, between Kundalini, between different serpent energies, between the Nagas, between different energies that are part of the same frequency, per se. So Adi Chankra knew this as Kundalini, right? And we know the Kundalini energy may be not just Dambala, but many different serpent energies working with us through the power of the light, the luz, how we say it, to infuse us with a sense of releasing and healing ourselves from limitations, right? So the symbol changes, but it points to the same, it remains consistent. The divine energy that lies dormant in human consciousness that is waiting to be awakened for a lot of Mambo and Hougans that are training already initiated and doing this work. They have been able to access part of that Kundalini energy and allow themselves to become a horse of the mainstream. Somebody that is going through initiation is doing the process to train themselves, to allow themselves to become a horse of the mainstream. Perhaps I do another video about that. What does that really mean? So the Mambo and Hougan aren't being, they're not just being syncretic or confused. They're operating from a very sophisticated understanding that all of these systems are different windows in the same underlying reality. So when spiritual connections are served in a mass scale, in what happened with the Inquisition, or what happened in India under the British colonial rule, or like what happened with the Jewish, or the things that I share about the Ayurveda and how it was demonized for a while. The same pattern occurred in the Caribbean, right? Where the same issues that happened, that people were demonized, the natives were demonized, the Africans were demonized. The European went through the witch trials, right? So every oppressor, right, what they were trying to do to kill the practitioners, but couldn't, because consciousness itself, cannot be killed. The tradition survived. They adapted. They encoded themselves in new forms. They became, the Buddha practitioners. He not only in Buddha, but also, with Lukumi and Ifa, where we're putting also syncretizing the saints with the orishas and so on, right? Like the Semins, the native Taino, they worship the Semins, the ancient powers that they knew as the Semin. Similar thing. Now we have these three coming into one, maintaining an authentic connection to nature that appear to have conformed to what the Spaniards and the other Europeans wanted, but it was just a show to continue a tradition that needed to survive, that was about connecting to nature, connecting to the ancient powers of nature. It's very animistic, right? So again, if we think about the genetic dimension of this, if persecution systematically eliminates certain bloodlines, the surviving lineages are going to carry a rare capacity, and it's going to increase because it has to be maintained. It's almost like you take from one, but you put more in another. So the Mambo and Hougans, they don't need medicine like the native, the natives in different Amazonian tribes. I have to use ayahuasca, or eventually learn to use ayahuasca, because a lot of the very powerful healers, the Merayas, for example, in Peru, they didn't need medicine. They only used the tobacco and some herbs. They didn't drink ayahuasca, right? And a lot of healers will say, we only take a little bit in order for us to enter, but we don't need the whole amount like people are doing now with the ayahuasca tourism to go into these rounds, because we can already access those rounds. It's the same thing with Mambo and the Hougans. The Mambo and Hougans don't need perhaps those medicine. They use the tobacco, they use the sacred technology of the tobacco, the sacred energy of the tobacco, and other things that they're doing, other rituals they're doing, in order for them to access the other side and to allow themselves to become the horse of the mainstream, to preserve these abilities, right, from being banished from the gene pool. In our case, for the Dominicans, in other people like the Puerto Ricans, it will be Sanse, or in Cuba, the Lukumi or Ifa or Palo, right? So the human nervous system is the instrument through which consciousness interfaces with this physical reality. It's not just a biological structure. It really is the bridge between the infinite and the finite. So when Chankra emphasized that the responsibility of being human with our incredible evolved nervous system is to maintain balance, because we are capable of experiencing the full spectrum of consciousness, from the most contracted to the most expanded. So the Mambo and Hougan really understand this intimately. They might know, some of them might not understand a lot of things that I'm saying from the words that I'm using, but they embody this. They can embody this knowledge, this wisdom. When the Lua mounts someone in possession, the spirit is using the person's nervous system to manifest in this reality. So this requires preparation, extraordinary preparation. In unprepared nervous system can be damaged by forces it cannot properly channel. So the bloodline research becomes really relevant here because these certain genetic sequences facilitate these experiences better than others. Individuals with those sequences that have a nervous system that is more naturally attuned to serving as conduits, as channels, as caballos. So this matters. I think this matters because this natural attunement doesn't mean it's automatic competence, though. It means there is a potential there. But we have to go through the discipline of understanding, healing our psyche, healing our nervous system. Some people, when you think about the nervous system, also consider the video that I did, and you can find a lot of other information about the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, if you don't work with the vagus nerve and you don't heal your nervous system, channeling, you can be channeling things that are not for your best intentions, because things that are very easy to channel, they don't have a lot of power. They don't have a lot of, the more ascended the being, the more power it requires to hold that in this physical realm. So I think I'm going to leave it here for now. There is a lot more that I can say, but I think that's enough for one video. All right, I'll see you all on the next one. Thank you.